This video is brought to you by Squarespace. Squarespace is the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence and run your business. Although the African continent had a number of powerful kingdoms in the early modern period like Kongo, Ethiopia, Mutapa and Morocco, by the end of the 18th century, most of them had been left weakened by civil wars, foreign intervention and constant warfare. Many of these wars were spurred on by the demand for slaves, but then the continent would completely change with the outbreak of the Napoleonic Wars, starting with Napoleon's invasion of Egypt. At that time, Egypt was ruled by the Ottomans, but that was just another power on the decline in the 18th century, and by then the Barbary states of North Africa were acting independent of their rule. Meanwhile, in Egypt, the Mamluks had largely ran the country for centuries. This was a military caste made up of slaves brought from the Caucasus, Balkans and the likes. So the ruling elite of Egypt was a different ethnicity to the larger Arab population. This meant when Napoleon invaded Egypt, he largely fought the Mamluks and their armies, and despite some early victories, Royal Navy blockades and disease forced Napoleon to flee. But the defeats of the Mamluks had created a power vacuum in the country, as power was then fought over between the Mamluks, Turkish governor sent by the Ottomans, and Muhammad Ali, a leader of Albanian troops that the Ottomans sent to fight the French. During the following years of chaos, Muhammad Ali was successful in defeating the Mamluks, cementing his control, and even expanding Egypt's borders. His first war was against a new sect of Islam in Saudi Arabia, named the Wahhabis. After this war, he invited the remaining Mamluks to celebrate, but as they entered the city, they were massacred. Those who survived by remaining in the countryside fled south to Sudan, but Muhammad Ali pursued them in 1820. This began Egypt's conquest of Sudan. However, Muhammad Ali had another reason for the conquest. As he wrote, "You are aware that the end of all our effort and this expense is to procure Negroes." And in this he was successful. The kingdom of Funj and the surrounding area were conquered by only 10,000 men or so, demonstrating to the world how a small, well-trained force using modern weapons can defeat a whole kingdom. After this, the Egyptians would launch further campaigns of conquest, taking Kassala, Fashoda, Suakin, Equatoria and Darfur by 1874. But one country they didn't conquer was Ethiopia. Meanwhile, Muhammad Ali's dynasty would fight wars against the Ottomans, and for a short while, they even took Syria. So they could be seen as the first true colonizers of Africa, who didn't just seek trading posts, but large stretches of land. Plus, even though his dynasty would remain officially under Ottoman control, they virtually acted independent, and Egypt under their rule would try to rapidly modernize. For instance, the Suez Canal would be built, which would bring European traders and colonizers into East Africa. However, the Egyptian wars and modernization plunged them into debt, and this led to the British entering the country, the Mahdist Wars, and a great deal more. But going back to the turn of the 19th century, there were a few changes that occurred during the Napoleonic Wars. For instance, the British took Mauritius from the French, but more importantly, there was the formation of the Zulu kingdom, formed by Shaka Zulu, and Bantu people who migrated south. Simultaneously, the British took the Dutch colony in South Africa, pushing the Dutch Boers on their great trek in 1836 to establish their own states. This meant that there was a three-way power struggle between the Boers, the British and the Zulu. However, these three powers obviously didn't just pop into being peacefully. They conquered and ruled over a number of different races. The British, for instance, went to war almost immediately against the Xhosa people. The first confrontation between them took place in the 1810s, when the Xhosa occupied the Zerveld region, which had acted as a buffer, but they were promptly driven out of it. There was another war that decade beginning in 1818, which was largely led by a Xhosa prophet named Mekana Untzeli. Now he allegedly had the power to turn bullets into water and hoped to unite the Xhosa against the British, who had seized thousands of cattle belonging to them. But the British had the support of the San people, and together they defeated the Xhosa. As for Mekana, he became the first person to be sentenced to prison on Robben Island, which became the infamous site of Nelson Mandela's imprisonment. In the intervening years, thousands of British settlers arrived in South Africa, while the Xhosa angered the Boers with their cattle raids. So Piet Retief sent his Boer commandos on punitive expeditions against them, while the Sixth Xhosa War erupted in 1834. It was another speedy victory for the British, who took more land and even imprisoned King Xhosa. However, while negotiating the payment for stolen cattle, the king tried to escape and was killed in the chase. However, despite this victory, Britain's inability to protect Boer settlers convinced them to take matters into their own hands and thus embark on the Great Trek north. However, tensions between the British and the Boers had been running high for some time. Obviously, English became the official language, and British laws and culture alienated the Boers. But what possibly angered them the most was Britain's racial policies. For instance, back in 1815, the British declared the natives of South Africa would be citizens and share the same rights. The British then outlawed slavery in the region in 1834, freeing 30,000 or so African slaves. At that time, it is believed over 90% of Boers in some regions like Stellenbosch owned slaves, so this, along with British weakness during the Xhosa cattle raids, prompted the Boers to set off north and establish their own republics. These treks lasted a couple of years, and only around 6,000 people, or 1/5 of the Dutch population, made the journey, and they faced attacks from all sides. The Matabele, for instance, attacked them early on, but in 1836 at the Battle of Vekkop, just 35 Boers held off an attack from over 5,000 Matabele warriors. The following punitive attacks pushed the Matabele out of the region and into Zimbabwe, where most of them live today. But their arrival came at the cost of the Shona people, and tensions between these communities continue to this day. But probably the worst attacks came from the Zulu. For instance, in 1838, Piet Retief met with Dingane, the Zulu king, to discuss a land treaty and watch a ceremonial performance. However, it was a trap, and 100 people, including Retief, were massacred. This was followed up with a number of other massacres like the Benin massacre, in which over 500 Boers were killed. So the Boers could well have been destroyed and chased out of their new land. But the betrayal and massacres encouraged them to meet the Zulu at the Battle of Blood River in late 1838. In this battle they were victorious and they set up the Republic of Natalia, while the Zulus descended into civil wars, as the Boers, under Pretorius, helped Mpande remove his brother Dingane from power. But the Boers were not allowed to remain in Natalia for long, as the British moved troops in there in 1842 and forced them out. So other Boer republics were established, like at Klip River, before, in the 1850s, the Orange Free State and Transvaal were established. But the Boers weren't the only people establishing new republics, as there was also the Griqua, a group of mixed-race people who set up their own republics, like Griqualand East and West in the 1860s, centered around mining areas. But let's just take a minute to thank Squarespace for making this video possible. Now, in recent months there has been a little bit of an uptake in this channel, and it's time for me to really spread out online. Maybe you're in a very similar position with your business, but like me, you have very limited experience online. Well, thanks to Squarespace, they make this incredibly easy. In just a few simple clicks, you can set up a website with some fantastic designs, or even connect it to an online shop. There's no back-end stuff to worry about, or out-of-date plugins. Everything just works, and it is designed to make everything ridiculously easy. But even if there are problems, there's always 24/7 support available to see you through any issues. So by the end of the day, you could have a website reporting the news of your hometown, selling your custom-made hats, or anything which you fancy. So head to squarespace.com/Jabzy to save on 10% of your first purchase of a website or domain. And now back to Africa. Then finally onto the Zulus, who probably launched the most destructive campaigns in the region. From around 1815 to 1840, the Zulus launched their wars of expansion, and this period has been called Umfekane by the original inhabitants. This word has many meanings, but think of it as meaning a scattering of people, as people were forced off their land, and it is estimated that over 1 million people were killed. People fled in every direction and established their own kingdoms and states. For instance, after the defeat of Undwandwe Shoshangani, he went to Mozambique and set up the Gaza Empire. The Fengu people, on the other hand, arrived in Xhosa land, putting further strain on their resources, and if you look at a map of South Africa today, you will see a tiny nation trapped inside it. This is Lesotho. The origins of this country date back to this period, as Moshoeshoe I took his Sotho people into the mountains to escape the Zulu wars. The other tiny nation in this region is Swaziland, or Eswatini, which still has a monarchy, but their monarchy goes back to the middle of the 18th century. Beforehand, the Swazi were living around Delgoa Bay in Mozambique, but they settled in the area that they are today, under the leadership of Dlamini III, and they are quite unique in not being affected by the Zulu Wars. To the east of them, the Portuguese still continued to rule Mozambique, but their power was largely on the wane by now, and a lot of trade along the east coast was now being conducted by the Omani people who ruled in Zanzibar. Yet, like the Griqua in South Africa, there was a collection of mixed-race people on their borders, who became incredibly influential in the region, often serving as intermediaries between the two groups of people. They, however, acted more like feudal lords, running large estates or prazos, which they were given in exchange for an annual fee. Their huge estates were protected by slave soldiers known as chikundu, and some families owned a few thousand of them. Some of these families would also become somewhat Africanized, and even became chiefs of local tribes. In later decades, the Portuguese would try to bring them back under their control, especially after David Livingstone began exploring the region. But some of these families, like the De Cruz family, were able to drive them back in 1868. David Livingstone, by the way, was a Scottish missionary who, largely on his own accord, began exploring Africa in the middle of the century. From South Africa, he journeyed north and established a mission as far away as Blantyre in modern-day Malawi. From the 1840s to the 1860s, he travelled around Africa and made some pretty strange alliances in the process. For instance, the Makololo travelled with him from Zambia to Malawi, and they would later fight alongside the British. During it all, he reported all of his findings back to the Europeans, including the resources of the continent and the Arab massacres of Africans, plus the ongoing slave trade. But very few cared initially. He eventually disappeared in 1869, and Henry Morton Stanley was sent out to find him. They met on the shores of Lake Tanganyika in 1871 with the famous words, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume." On Stanley, he was also struggling to find funding for exploration, and he often depended on newspapers rather than his own government. Eventually he relented and went to Leopold II of Belgium, the only European leader eager to colonize the area. But he would later be horrified to find out Leopold's intentions. Now these might be two of the most famous explorers, but they were far from the first. The Scottish in particular had a number of explorers around Africa, like MacGregor Laird, who travelled along the Niger in the 1830s, and Alexander Gordon Laing, who travelled to Timbuktu back in the 1820s. The Irish-born Frenchman, Antoine Thomas de Abadie, explored Ethiopia in the 1830s, and Richard Francis Burton, a peculiar explorer, tried to find the source of the Nile. But Burton also went to Mecca dressed as a Muslim, gained the nickname Ruffian Dick for getting into fights, and collected measurements of people's penises wherever he went. Yet he was probably inspired by a much earlier explorer, Johann Ludwig Burckhardt, a Swiss explorer who went on the Hajj, rediscovered incredibly famous sites like Petra and Abu Simbel in the 1820s, but ultimately was prevented from travelling beyond Egypt by the local authorities. There was also some German explorers like Heinrich Barth, who explored the Sahara and West Africa, and the Latvian-born German George August Schweinfurt, who explored Sudan. But once again, these were largely privately funded expeditions, led by botanists or missionaries, and they really didn't come from the colonial ambitions of any European government, at least before the 1870s. So British explorers were journeying out of South Africa, while they continued to fight against the Xhosa. These wars went until the 1870s, and one of the strangest episodes of these wars was the cattle-killing movement of the 1850s. This began when a 16-year-old prophetess claimed that she had spoken with the Xhosa ancestors, and they promised to aid them drive the Europeans into the sea. But they were only willing to help the living Xhosa if they destroyed all of their current means of substance. So they burnt down their own crops and killed thousands of cattle. Even the leaders began to demand people do it. But when the day of reckoning was supposed to come in 1858, obviously they were disappointed, and thousands died of starvation. Meanwhile, before the scramble, the British were fighting elsewhere in Africa. Going back to the beginning of the century in the West, the British were getting involved in wars along the Gold Coast, because, just like in the Americas, Europeans would often align with different tribes or nations. There, the British often aided the Fanti Confederacy, while the Dutch, historically, helped the far more powerful Ashanti kingdom. The Fanti, by the way, also flew Asafo flags in battle, something very similar to a regimental flag, many of which featured a Union Jack. So the British, albeit in a very minor way, got involved in the Ashanti-Fanti War of 1806. Then the Ashanti fought the Fanti again in 1811 and won again. But the Kingdom of Ashanti's most ambitious war of conquest came in 1814, when they conquered large sections of the Gold Coast with an army of 20,000 men and threatened to remove the Europeans from the area. So in 1817, the British African Company of Merchants signed a treaty of friendship with them, recognizing their recent conquests. However, the British African Company of Merchants was soon dissolved in 1821, and the British government took control of the West African colonies. Shortly afterwards, in 1823, the Ashanti killed soldiers in the British Royal African Regiment, leading to the First Anglo-Ashanti War. During this war, the British were actually defeated in early battles, and their commander, Charles McCarthy, was killed and his skull was turned into a cup, and his heart was allegedly eaten. But during that fatal battle, only 4 crates of supplies were brought to the front line, 3 of which only contained macaroni. Therefore, the 500 people in the British army were doomed against the 10,000 Ashanti. So to counterattack, the British brought Congreve rockets into the region and drove the Ashanti back, securing a great deal of the Gold Coast, either directly under their control or under the control of their allies like the Fanti. Plus, it should also be said that the African Company of Merchants was also dissolved because they were still allegedly trading in slaves, something that was banned in 1807. This ban was taken incredibly seriously by the British, as they also created the West African Squadron, which patrolled the seas in the area, hoping to stop slave ships. To further help in this effort, they formed a new base in Banjul in 1816, and this would be the basis of the Gambia in the following decades. However, only 20 ships patrolled the entire West African coast, so maybe only 10% of ships were stopped crossing the Atlantic, and it's believed that thousands of slaves were just thrown overboard as the slavers didn't want to pay the fines to the British. Still, it is believed over 150,000 slaves were liberated in these decades and were brought back to Africa, while in Africa, this ban on slavery had major consequences. The powers that had emerged over the last couple hundred years had based their economies on the export of slaves, along with other items like palm oil and the likes. So the ban weakened their states, and it was met with outrage by many African leaders, like the King of Bonny in Nigeria, who wrote to the British saying, "We think this trade must go on. They say that your country, however great, can never stop a trade ordained by God himself." Plus, the ban did little to stop the trade of slaves within Africa. The Igbo people, for instance, continued trading, while the Dahomey used slaves as a display of wealth and prestige. As King Gezo of Dahomey wrote in the 1840s, "The slave trade is the ruling principle of my people. It is the source and the glory of their wealth. The mother lulls the child to sleep with notes of triumph over an enemy reduced to slavery." These kingdoms continue to find some markets to export to, primarily Brazil, which only abolished slavery in 1888. Plus, there was also still the option of selling to Islamic slave traders, while within Africa, Mauritania only abolished slavery in 1981, and they still had slaveholders in the 21st century. Otherwise, the abolition of slavery made colonies in Africa far less profitable. As mentioned before, this led to nations like Denmark selling their colonies in the 19th century. Then things became more complicated, as many of the slaves who were freed migrated to Nigeria beginning in the 1830s, where they were called the Saro people. Some of these people, as they migrated, were just enslaved again though, or they were used as some sort of political tool. For instance, the ruler of Lagos, a major slave trading port, was Oba Akitoye. He was willing to ban slavery across his state in order to secure British support, but this was of course unpopular among the slave owners and traders, so they rebelled and placed his brother Kosoko on the throne. In exile, he appealed to the British for help, and they obliged in 1851, on the assurance that he would ban the slave trade. A fleet was dispatched to Lagos, they bombarded the city, and installed Akitoye on the throne. But he died shortly afterwards, and there was another power struggle between his son, Dosunmu, and Kosoko. Then there was another problem for Britain. The French had been forming trade agreements with nearby rulers like Soji, the king of Porto Novo, who was obviously worried about British military action. The rulers of Lagos also flirted with the idea of accepting French protection, and this convinced Lord Palmerston to act before the French did. So in 1861, British ships arrived once again, and Lagos became a British protectorate, thus establishing a foothold in what would become Nigeria. This also put the British remarkably close to one of the oldest kingdoms in Africa, the Kingdom of Benin. which is most famous for their remarkably large capital city and the huge walls defending it. In fact, back in the 1600s, many European explorers said that the city was equal in size to some of their own cities back home. But large walls, or at least large gates, were not unique to Benin, as in the north the Xhosa states like Kano, Zazao and Katsina all had huge gates defending their palaces and cities. But back on the coast, the French and local African rulers were obviously angry by British expansion. While the British were supposed to be freeing slaves, they were simultaneously taking fresh colonies in Gambia and Nigeria. So in 1863, Rozvi of Porto Novo signed an agreement with the French. But the French were not really better in this regard, as just nearby, back in the 1840s, they signed an agreement with the Nzema people of the Ivory Coast. This allowed them to set up a fort in Grand Bassam and expand their influence in the region. But going back to slavery, the British even began to bring freed slaves from across North America and even Europe to their main base in West Africa, Sierra Leone. This colony was home to the infamous Bunce Island, but even when slavery was legal, there was a huge scheme to resettle black people in this area. Many of these black people fought alongside the British in the American Revolution in exchange for their freedom, while others like Olaudah Equiano was able to purchase his freedom in the Caribbean. He, like many others, went to live in England and formed the Sons of Africa group, aimed at abolishing the slave trade. Meanwhile, white abolitionists set up the Committee for the Relief of the Black Poor. They believed that sending the poor black people from Canada or the UK back to Africa would help relieve their poverty. But this plan also got support from many racists who hoped to remove black people from their countries. Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger said they should be sent somewhere and be no longer suffered to infest the streets of London. So with government approval, former slaves from England and Nova Scotia were resettled in Sierra Leone, where they founded the city of Freetown. On arrival, they had many rights and even elected their officials, but they were given very few supplies, faced conflicts with their African neighbours, and back in 1799 they rebelled. To crush the rebellion, the British used Jamaican Maroons. Now these Maroons had escaped from slavery and lived in the countryside of Jamaica, but in the 1790s they also rebelled against the British. Many of them were deported to Canada, but on the outset of the rebellion in Sierra Leone, 500 of them were transported to Africa to crush the rebels. In return, they were given land and became part of the new social elite. So within this new society, there were Maroons, the Nova Scotians as they were called, liberated Africans the West African Squadron had taken from slave ships, and the local people. These groups would rarely get along. For instance, a Maroon leader named Major Jarrett was killed by his liberated African employee. This prompted attacks from both sides until many Maroons fled back across the Atlantic. But over time during the 19th century, these three immigrant groups would begin to merge together into the Creole people of Sierra Leone. They lived in homes that were clearly inspired by their old homes in southern USA, they developed their own language known as Creole, and they even began trading down the West African coast and settling in new countries. Then, just across their eastern border, the country of Liberia had a very similar origin tale. There, the American Colonization Society acquired land from the Gola ruler, named King Peter, in 1821. This land served as a base for the former slaves to arrive in, but from the beginning, they too faced attacks from the locals, specifically the Malinka people. But the liberated slaves in Liberia also had government support from President Monroe, and in his honor, they named their first town Monrovia. Only a few thousand people actually made the trip to Liberia, and of them, less than 2,000 were still alive by 1841, when Joseph Jenkins Roberts declared that the country was independent. However, the history of Liberia took quite a dark turn, as the Americo-Liberians began to emulate the slave owners of Southern America. So their society was based upon segregation, with them at the top, despite never making up more than 5% of the population. Their numbers were bolstered with the arrival of people from the Caribbean in the 1860s, and a mass exodus of former slaves from South Carolina a decade later. This ruling class of Americo-Liberians were criticized as late as the 1920s for still using slave labor, and they kept hold of power until the outbreak of the Civil War in Liberia in 1980. Nevertheless, the independence of Liberia was recognized by the great powers very early on, meaning it was the two countries that was never colonized by the Europeans. However, to compare it to the Ethiopians, is a little problematic, as Liberia was seemingly born out of the effort of colonizers, just a different sort of colonizer. Plus, on slavery elsewhere, there was still the threat of Islamic slave raids in Europe thanks to the Barbary states of North Africa at the turn of the 19th century. But the Americans under Thomas Jefferson refused to pay tribute to them, beginning the Barbary Wars. Algiers and Tripoli were bombarded by the American fleet, and then, after the Napoleonic Wars, the British also bombarded Algiers when they massacred Christian slaves. This, as well as more advanced European ships, greatly reduced the power of these once feared states. Then, Algeria would also be the first state in North Africa to fall to the Europeans, specifically the French. The French conquest began in 1827 when Charles X blockaded their capital. The justification behind the blockade, however, was a farce, as it began when the ruler of Algiers demanded the French pay their bills for supplies given to them during Napoleon's campaign in Egypt. The French initially refused to respond, but their ambassador was whipped by the Algerians, prompting the blockade. However, this just gave Charles the course for war that he wanted, as he was keen to find a distraction for the French people. He was, after all, the king, and his unpopular Bourbon dynasty had been restored after the fall of Napoleon. So, to gain public support, he invaded Algeria in 1830. This did little to help Charles though, as he was removed from power during the July Revolution. Nevertheless, the invasion continued, and initially, the French held very little power outside the major cities of Oran, Algiers and Bonnet. So they had to pacify the rest of the region, and to do so, they created the French Foreign Legion in 1831. This had a number of benefits to the new ruler of France, Louis Philippe. For starters, he came to power with the help of French liberals, people who were largely opposed to the Algerian War. So by sending off foreigners, he could appease them. Plus, it also served as a place to throw the old guards of the French kings, like the Swiss guards, who had defended Charles during the July Revolution. So this new Foreign Legion helped the French gradually expand their control in Algeria, and by the middle of the 19th century, they controlled most of the coast, forcing many Algerians into Morocco to organize their resistance. This just resulted in the extremely short Franco-Moroccan War of 1844, which the French won, and their control over Algeria was formally recognized by the Moroccans. Then, in the 1850s, the French launched a further campaign of conquest in Senegal. This could be seen as part of a much larger French effort to expand their empire under their new ruler Napoleon III, who also moved into Southeast Asia and Mexico. But looking at these conflicts as connected is often problematic, and this will be especially true during the Scramble. This is because the governors of various colonies would often act independently of the central government, or were responding to immediate problems. So the campaigns in Senegal really could have begun in the 1820s, after the French colonies were left weakened, after the British took them during the Napoleonic Wars, and only returned them to France if they promised to abolish slavery. The trade in acacia gum therefore began to grow more important as a replacement source of income, as it was extremely important as a dye in the growing textile industry of Europe. But the weakened French outposts in Senegal faced the growing power of the Emirate of Trarza, who often raided their neighbours, the Walu Kingdom. These two, however, were close to uniting through marriage, which would give them control of both banks of the Senegal River, so the French attacked them in 1825 to end this union. Then, fast forward to the 1840s and 1850s, the French companies were building more forts along the banks of the Senegal River, angering the local states. So Trarza united with Walu again, and even their old rivals, the Emirate of Brakna. They launched a united raid on the French port of St. Louis in 1855, but the French responded quickly and successfully and took control of Walu, which had existed for centuries. But the last queen of Walu, Undate Yale Mbonj, was facing invasions from Muslim states in the north and the French throughout most of her reign, so she really stood very little chance of survival. The French victory then brought them closer to the borders of a new African state, the Tukulur Empire, which had been created by Omar Saido Tall. Think of this as an extension of the jihadist states of West Africa, as they were essentially just the unification of the most western ones. Under Omar, they launched an attack on the French in 1857, but were pushed back and the new spheres of influence were recognized. The French were therefore free to start picking off the small kingdoms in Senegal, and quite quickly, a new enemy appeared in the King of Sinai. He attacked the French just 2 years later, but was defeated at the Battle of Logandemi, and he lost some of his provinces. But the wars obviously didn't end there, as the Siamese spent the next decade or so destroying French infrastructure until their king was assassinated by the French in 1871. A very similar fate was in store for the other Senegalese kingdoms, like Kayor, Saloum and Baol. Despite fierce resistance and the occasional jihad, they were all absorbed into French Senegal. However, these wars and raids destroyed much of the farmland and infrastructure of Senegal, leaving the area crippled. But it would become the centre of French West Africa, and the French would later hope to connect it to their new colony on the east coast of Africa in Djibouti. This colony was created back in 1862, when the French bought land around Obok from the Sultan of Afar named Rajita Dini Ahmet. And this brings me right the way back to Egypt, because two events in the 1860s set the stage for the scramble for Africa. As stated before, the Egyptians launched campaigns of conquest in the Sudan, and their wars against the Ottomans in the 1830s split the support of European powers, as France supported Egypt, while Britain and Austria sent ships to help the Ottomans. But largely, the country was free from European ambitions until the outbreak of the American Civil War. As Southern American cotton was not making its way to Europe, the factories in Britain and France were brought to a standstill. Many Brits hoped to enter the war on the Confederate side to end this cotton famine, and the French, who were already active in Mexico, were even more keen. But the Confederates' King Cotton Plan ultimately failed, as the Europeans found another solution. They began to look at Egypt's growing cotton industry, yet to encourage this trade, the Egyptians fell further into debt by building railway lines. However, the American Civil War and this new market made Egypt and Africa as a whole a more attractive option for resources. Then the second great event was the construction of the Suez Canal. Construction began with the French Suez Canal Company, created by Ferdinand de Lesseps. Said, the ruler or the Khedive of Egypt, also invested a lot of money into stocks. Plus, as a bit of a side note, as the French and Egyptians began working together, Said agreed to help Napoleon in his invasion of Mexico, and sent hundreds of Sudanese slaves to fight alongside them. Anyway, as construction was underway, Europeans began to correctly see that East Africa would become incredibly important to international shipping. So this is why the French purchased part of what would become Djibouti several years before the Suez Canal opened. But just across the Red Sea, there was already a British colony at Aden, and this dated back to the 1830s, when the British took the town to serve as a coaling station for their ships on the way to India. Also, nearby, another colonial power joined in the race, the Italians. Their ambitions in East Africa are largely the result of Giuseppe Sapanto's explorations of Ethiopia and his insistence on Italian expansion. So, in 1869, the newly unified Italian kingdom listened to his calls and sent him to purchase land around Assab Bay from the Danakil chiefs. This territory was initially owned by a private company, but it would serve as the foundation of Italian Eritrea. And this brings me on to a crucial part of the history. In the 19th century, Europe saw the creation of a number of new states, all eager to establish colonies. Going back to the July Revolution in France, this inspired another revolution, the Belgian Revolution, against the Dutch rulers. This small country and its new kings, the German Leopold I and his son Leopold II, would try to desperately seek out new colonies. This included the Philippines, Cuba, various Caribbean islands, and even at one point, Texas. But they were only really successful in the Congo. The Italians then came into the picture in the 1860s, and then in 1871, the Prussians defeated the French and created the German Empire. This encouraged both sides to develop colonial empires. For starters, the humiliated French sought to find land and resources outside of Europe, while the Germans wanted their place in the sun. So the arrival of new European powers completely changed the status quo in Africa, prompting the old powers to claim territories that they had previously been uninterested in. But just before I end this episode, I need to highlight developments in one country, and that's Ethiopia. They had been left weakened in the 18th century as various leaders ruled independently of the emperor during their age of princes. However, in the 19th century, a bandit named Sahi Dingil began to gather a large following. He grew so powerful that the empress married off her granddaughter to him. But this did little to help them, as in 1852, he rose up against his in-laws, took the throne, and became Theodoros II. As emperor, he was wary of the growing Egyptian power to the north, so he too tried to rapidly modernize his country. but to do so, he forced European missionaries to produce cannons for him, which were obviously terrible, and he wrote numerous letters to Queen Victoria asking for weapons. But these letters were ignored. This would have seemed strange to him, as he, like the Ethiopians in centuries past, believed an Ethiopian-European alliance could have destroyed the Muslims. However, now the British were invested in Egypt and had very little to gain through an Ethiopian alliance. So Theodorus imprisoned the foreigners in his country and demanded weapons for their release. This was disastrous though, as the British in 1867 sent an army into Ethiopia to free them. Theodorus had very few followers among the various ethnicities, so the British were able to take his capital city while he committed suicide. This created a power vacuum in the country as different factions fought for the newly vacant throne. But eventually Johannes IV would succeed. He would go on to defend Ethiopia against attacks from the Egyptians and even the Mahdists of Sudan. Plus he would also become a colonizer of sorts, as under his rule Ethiopia would expand their empire from their homeland in the north to the borders of Kenya in the south. Therefore the Ethiopians, like the Egyptians, would become the forgotten participants in the scramble for Africa. But that's where I'll leave it. Over the first half of the 19th century, the Americans set up Liberia and defeated the Barbary pirates. Britain expanded their control in South Africa and West Africa. The French took Senegal, Djibouti and Algeria. The Italians entered Eritrea. The Portuguese maintained their hold along the coast. The Egyptians became essentially independent, took Sudan and built the Suez Canal. Boer republics were established in the south, and jihadi states in the west expanded, all of which predate the traditional starting point of the scramble for Africa.